Hello, welcome to my headphone review. If you're new to this channel, don't be worried. This is because this channel is basically quite new. This is my first video, in fact. And I'm here to talk about these pair of headphones. So these are the Audio-Technica ATH-MSR7bs. But first, I'd just like to give a little bit of background context surrounding who I am, just to give a bit of credibility or lack thereof to this review. So basically, I've been in the audio hobby for quite a while now, specifically to do with headphones. I do have some experience with speakers, the quite low-end speakers, to be fair. Some Edifier bookshelf speakers, Logitech PC speakers. I mostly tend to listen to headphones because I live in a very small room, and obviously with speakers, you're dealing with the physics of the room. You're dealing with the room modes. There's going to be peaks and dips in the frequency response of speakers just based on where you're listening. So you need to have a treated room. Obviously, I'm a student in Australia, so I don't really have the budget to really get into speakers right now. So I tend to invest a lot of my money in terms of audio gear into headphones. And these, I don't want to say that these are underrated because, or even underrepresented because the predecessor to this, the MSR7, which was released, I believe sometime around 2014, 2015, has actually garnered a lot of, let's say, recognition in the industry, particularly from, I know Tile from Inner Fidelity has raved about these, and so has Lachlan. I never got a chance to hear the original MSR7s, but I have heard a lot of Audio-Technica products in the past. So this is a Japanese manufacturer that is kind of famous for their upper mid presentation on the headphones, which arguably is forward. It is quite present in the mix. It allows, as many people say, female vocalists to sort of stand out, and also in combination with that, there is typically a sort of, I don't want to say lean bass presentation, but it's not generally as accentuated as some other brands might be. So obviously there are exceptions. The M50x is probably the most popular studio headphone in existence right now. And that headphone definitely has a bass boost. It's a really quite like a V-shaped, or if you want to be nice to it, it's like a U-shaped sound, the M50X. It's quite a prominent V-shape, which means you get accentuated bass. There's like a hump. It extends, from memory, I can't recall, but I believe it extends up to around 400 hertz or so, which is kind of intruding on the lower mids, and that makes it sound a bit thick. It gives it a nice punch, but it also tends to make the bass notes sound a bit too blurry. They blur into the mids. They don't stand distinct from the mids. But anyway, that's beside the point. I'm not really here to talk about the M50Xs. What I am here to talk about today is the MSR7Bs. So this comes from the consumer line of headphones from Audio-Technica, and they are quite a nice pair of headphones. I first just like to talk about the design briefly. It's a pretty, standard headphone design. You got the ear capsules here. There's a larger sort of oval shape here where your ears would, sort of rest, which allows the ear cups to be, they're pretty large, I'd say. Not large, like overly large, but they're definitely an oversized, not oversized, they're definitely an over ear, my apologies, pair of headphones, so your ears will rest comfortably inside the opening of the MSR7Bs. At least my ears do, and I think for most people, theirs would too. In terms of depth, they're not the deepest ear pads that I've seen, but I've worn these for a few hours at a time, and I don't really find them uncomfortable at all. This is probably due to the really light weight of this design. I believe it's around 230 grams. Don't quote me, but that is, I think, what I've read. And that makes these headphones quite light, actually. Pretty much one of the lightest pairs available in the market today, unless you want to go for like a COS Porta Pro or a COS KSC75, but this is definitely a light headphone and very comfortable. The ear pads are made out of memory foam. Unfortunately, it's just pleather, so it's not like a real leather, so this will eventually need, replacing. And the headband too, but, considering that this is a consumer line of headphones, I don't think many people are too worried about that. And Yaxi, the Japanese earpad manufacturer, sell aftermarket earpads for these, so if you eventually need to replace them, you should be fine. And the design overall is quite decent. You have a double-sided cable entry, which is, I would say, unusual for a portable sort of headphone, because mostly people like it single-sided, so it's a lot easier. You don't need to have two wires sticking out the headphone, you only need one. But this is so that this headphone can run balanced. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a balanced amp to actually use with this headphone. I just use a FiO E10K right there. It's kind of like a really cheap budget amp. I'm generally not a believer though in like amplification. I just think that, but that's a whole other issue. And these connectors are proprietary to Audio-Technica, so if you need a replacement cable, you will definitely have to, they're definitely harder to find than just a reliable, normal 3.5 millimeter sort of plug. These are Audio-Technica's A2 DC connector, but I don't really think that they'll have any issues. And as long as you take care of your cable, it should be fine. And this cable is, fine. It kind of feels like an earphone cable actually, because I don't know if you can see, but the split is this sort of dual length here. So it's not like it blends into one cable, but it's two separate ones that go into the 3.5 millimeter jack. And it is like, it's a decent gauge. It's not too thick. It's not too thin either. I'd say it's relatively okay. But anyway, the cable is just nothing special, I'd say. But what is special is generally the sound of this headphone. So there are 45 millimeter drivers inside here. I don't know whether they're the same as the M50Xs, or actually they're not, because this has what Audio-Technica calls a DLC carbon coated diaphragm, which is a diamond-like carbon coating. And that is, to basically improve the rigidity of the diaphragm so that it moves like a piston and it doesn't flex, which can, introduce standing waves and those peaks in the frequency response that are generally unwanted. Now, obviously, being an Audio-Technica, this is not really a flat headphone. So if you've ever heard the Sennheiser, like HD600, this is definitely not one of those. This is a kind of a stereotypical Japanese sort of sound. So there is, I don't want to say lean bass presentation, but definitely for most people, it would sound a bit lacking in the bass, but that's not necessarily because it is lean, but because there is an upper mid accentuation. So if I were to characterize the general frequency response of this headphone, I would say that there is definitely a sub bass roll off. I haven't verified this with test tones, like specifically to see where it lies, but I do think that it's below maybe like 80 hertz, 100 hertz. There's a very gentle sub bass roll off. It's not like a deep, steep sub bass roll off. It's kind of a gentle one. So if you're looking for that last word of impact and slam, this headphone probably is not for you, especially if you're into like the trap, the hip hop genres. You can probably find a better headphone that will suit that in terms of really hard hitting presentation. But what's great about this is that the bass on this is agile and very, very fast. It is also very textured too. So if you've used an M50X before, there's definitely a bit of a bass bump. This sounds like you removed that from the M50X. The bass just sounds a lot cleaner and tighter. It works very well in any genre that is fast-paced. So, I listen to a lot of rock and metal, and this headphone performs kind of spectacularly for that. The mids, they actually are quite neutral. There might be the slightest hint of a bump at, I would say, well, as I said before, the upper mids are accentuated quite moderately. So that gives female vocalists and just synths in general just that rise, but it's a very tasteful rise. It's not a sort of harsh or really peaky rise. It's just a gentle curve up towards the upper mids, which just gives those elements in songs just that extra bit of attention. And that is really where I find this headphone quite engaging, because when you listen to any song with female vocalists, their voice just seems to penetrate through the mix, not in a way that is harsh or abrasive, but in a way that is sort of adds character to their voice. And that is what I think this headphone does really well. In terms of treble, I believe that, yeah, the treble is definitely accentuated here too. It's a bit bright. Not bright in a biodynamic sort of bright, but just, it's like a tilt, like a very gentle tilt, I must say. And at first I thought that the treble here was a bit grainy, but now that I've listened to this a bit more, I don't think it's necessarily grainy as much as it actually sort of reveals the character of and flaws, I'd say, of songs. So I'd say that this headphone, I mean, I've looked at measurements online, it's a very low distortion headphone. Throughout the whole frequency, the bass, mids, and treble have very low distortion. And the graininess that I think I hear in this, perhaps there are a bit of some peaks and dips in the upper treble, the mid upper treble, which adds a bit of grain to headphones. But in terms of this specific headphone, this will really let you hear the quality of your recordings. Now, I know that this isn't even technically a reference headphone or a monitoring headphone, and I'm not sure why Audio-Technica puts the M50X as a sort of reference headphone, because I think that is definitely a more colored headphone than this. This is definitely still colored, but it's not as colored as the M50X, and it's colored in a more tasteful way that I would say, you can argue that it is a representation of neutral, just with an upper mid and maybe like lower treble lift, which definitely adds excitement. So cymbals, female vocalists, a lot of synths, high-pitched violins, they really soar through the mix. And it does it in a way that is clean and precise. The only criticism I'd really have is because that it has that upper mid, lower treble rise, it can definitely reveal flaws in some recordings. So some recordings, it will highlight if the cymbal quality in the recordings isn't good. So I was listening to a Charlie XCX song, and I realized that the cymbals sounded a bit grainy, a bit tingy, a bit weird. But then I was also listening to those on my Etymotic ER2 XRs, which, by the way, do not have any sort of upper mid lift or like treble lift. It's basically like a really flat response throughout the mids, just with a bass boost. And that also had it highlighted the same graininess to the treble, but not to the same extent as this, because this has that, rise, which made me think that this headphone wasn't grainy in itself. It was just highlighting what was already in the recording. So, and also, I guess another criticism is the bass roll off. I would prefer, definitely, if it didn't roll off, it was like a flat bass response. I don't like a sub bass that rises in the response. I like it generally like a flat, or maybe like a very gentle rise. Definitely not a Harman, like +5, +6 dB rise, like below 50 Hertz. That's not really my type of thing. But other than that, I would say that this is a very, very good value headphone. This is definitely better than an M50X. I would say that, I'm trying to think of what other headphones I've heard recently that I can compare this to. I have owned an HD600 in the past. This is definitely not as sort of textbook neutral as that. Also, I don't think the treble quality on this is as good as the HD600. The HD600 is just a bit smoother and a more referencey sort of sound, I guess. Even though that has its own issues, I find the HD600 to have kind of like a bit of a slow bass. It wasn't necessarily the fastest bass in the world, and there was more of a roll off with the HD600 compared to this. But if you're looking for generally just a closed do-it-all headphone, I would say this hits the mark. Oh, also, I also forgot to mention, Soundstage is quite decent on this. Definitely a lot better, a big improvement over the M50X and especially the M40X. That was one of the most closed-in headphones I've ever heard. This one actually does have a, I wouldn't say like a wide soundstage, but it doesn't feel closed in. The center image, there's a definite left, a center right image, and between that space it's filled in pretty naturally. So it's not like a super big left, super big wide, and super like narrow center. It's a very filled in soundstage. And it does have a bigger soundstage than I was expecting, considering that the ear cups, they're not the deepest. Even though my ears do fit in comfortably, the driver is quite close to your ear. But I don't know what they've done. Maybe it's the dual layer damping structure using the headphone. There's like a vent here. There's also like a vent at the top here, and apparently this capsule is divided into 2 layers to control the air flow. I'm not really sure in terms of the physics, but I can say that whatever they've done, it has worked. There's a very tight bass here. The mids, low mids, generally neutral. Upper mids, there's a rise, but a tasteful rise. And you could argue lower treble extends into that too. Upper treble is, you know, I'd say a bit accentuated too. Not to the level of the upper mids, but definitely up there. And there is air too. I wouldn't say it's like a crazy amount of air, but I mean, I don't know what else to say. This is a really, really well done product from Audio-Technica, and I'm happy to use this as my daily pair for now, even though I have, you know, I probably need a pair of open backs soon, but yeah, well, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, comments, feedback, you know, please leave that in the comments. I'd very much like to know. But yeah, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video.